was thinking the other day, exactly 3 weeks from today, the New York team will be ministering in New York City. The church we stay at, Pastor Ron's church, every time we go, he usually asks us to help him with the morning service. And so the last time we went down, he asked me if I'd preach. I said, how much time do I have, Pastor Ron? He goes, is an hour and 15 minutes too short? And I'm like, wow. Is that for the whole service? He goes, no, that's for you to speak. He goes, the rest of it takes care of itself. And I found out over time that it's easier to preach for an hour and 15 minutes than it is for 20 minutes. So I'm not going to preach for an hour and 15 minutes. Don't panic. I'm just saying. It's crazy down there. So the topic today is the new math of grace. Interesting title. I had about 3 different sermons that I was going back and forth between, and I just kept coming back to this one on grace. And I just prayed one day. I said, God, everyone here, we know about grace. Why do you keep bringing this one to me? And then I remembered back about, probably about February, we were driving home from youth one night, and I said to Jacob, how was youth tonight? He goes, it was all right. You love hearing that from your son when you're the youth pastor. So I said to him, what could we have done differently? He goes, Dad, why are we spending so much time talking about Jesus and the parables? I'm like, well, that's how Jesus preached, and that's what we're talking about. And he goes, yeah, but I've heard it before. I said, I know, but it's important to hear it every now and then, because you might take something different away from it. And so I said to God, all right, let's talk about grace, because I guess you've got something that you want to talk about. So I came up with this title, The New Math of Grace. I'd read a couple articles, and of course, scientists and now mathematicians and all these people, they always look through the Bible and try to point out the faults of the Bible. Scientists, no matter how hard they try, they just have never been able to poke too many holes in it. So now the people in the mathematics world are getting a hold of it and saying, well, some of the numbers just don't add up. And in the Bible, that is true, but a lot of the numbers come from miracles, and you just got to say, that was a miracle. And the mathematicians even agree. They're like, we agree miracles can happen. But there are 4 things that we're going to talk about this morning that, from just the math standpoint of it just doesn't make sense. And of course, those of you that have heard me preach before, Margot always does my proofreading. And she loves math. She is a mathaholic. So, she's not. And so when I gave her this, I said, can you read this over? She goes, I can't do it. I said, why? She goes, it has math in the title. I said, well, I'll read it anyway. So we're going to look at 4 stories. One we're going to pick apart a little bit. But the first one, in Luke, we all know the parable of the lost sheep. And when you read that parable, we've read it. Some of you are older than I am. You've read it more than I have. But it's one that you read all the time. And you hear about this shepherd who he's lost one sheep, so he goes looking for it. And you read that and you're going, oh, that's beautiful. But then from the math point of view, that just makes no sense. He went looking for one sheep and he left the other 99. And you're sitting there going, well, that doesn't make sense. Because it says, he goes to look for the lost sheep because, it's out there alone and it's vulnerable. So here's the shepherd. I'm going to go and I'm going to look for one sheep. And I'm going to leave the other 99. And I'm just going to hope that nothing happens to them while I'm away. But what happens if you come back with the one sheep that you found and all of a sudden you're missing another 23 now? You have no idea where they went. So from a math standpoint, it literally makes no sense. And mathematicians will look at it and they'll go, well, that doesn't make mathematical sense. They're like, it'd be better off to go back with 99 sheep and just tell the owner of the sheep, I lost one. Because back in those days, those things just happened. You went back, you lost sheep. But this shepherd, it says he went out and he looked for the one. And even though it doesn't make mathematical sense, to Jesus it makes sense. The next one we look at is from the book of John. We hear about Mary who goes in and she just anoints Jesus' feet with a whole bottle of expensive perfume. And it says this perfume was so expensive it was about a year's wages. And you sit there and you go, she just spent a year's wages and she dumped it all over the floor. And you're sitting there going, wouldn't just a little bit have done the same thing? It would have filled the room with the perfume. It would have filled the room with the smell. And then she still would have had some left. And when you read about it, it says, Judas even said, we could have sold that. We could have given the money to the poor. And he was right. They could have. They could have helped so many people with that. Because just one little ounce would have done the same thing. So you sit there and you go, well, from a math standpoint, Mary, who's the one that poured this all over Jesus' feet, she obviously wasn't good with math because she just wasted all that money. That's how we look at it. If you look at it from a pure mathematical standpoint, she wasted money. But we all know that Jesus doesn't look at it that way. The one from Mark we're going to look at, he rebukes the Pharisees because a woman comes up and she tosses 2 tiny coins in the plate, and Jesus looks at the Pharisees and says, "This woman has given more than you." Now a treasurer in the church, he would disagree. He'd say, "But these Pharisees, they're coming with handfuls of money. How can you tell me that these 2 coins are worth more than a wad of $100 bills, if we want to talk about it in modern day terms? How can you tell us that that's not the same?" Because from them, from a math standpoint, that doesn't make sense. If I come up and put a whole bunch of gold coins in the plate, you're telling me that that's not worth more than these 2 puny coins of this lady? And once again, if you look at it from a pure mathematical standpoint, it makes no sense. But we know that's not how Jesus looks at it. And the fourth one that we're going to look at, and the one that we're actually going to look at a little bit more in depth, is from Matthew. And it's the parable of the vineyard. And we've all heard this one as well. Jesus tells the story where the farmer goes out and he hires people at sunrise to come and pick his grapes for him. And then he goes out again, probably mid-morning, gets some more. He goes out at lunchtime and gets some more. And he even goes out with about an hour left of the workday, and he even brings in some more. And so you're sitting there and you're like, when we read the end of the parable, we know that they all got paid the same. And so when you sit there and think of it from a mathematical standpoint, well, that doesn't make sense. As someone that runs a business, you're sitting there going, why would you pay someone who worked an hour the exact same as someone who worked 8 hours? You're not going to be in business very long if you keep doing that. And so we sit there and we go, you know what? These 4 stories in the Bible, from a mathematical standpoint, the only word we can use is atrocious. That's just atrocious math. It makes no sense. I mean, in the school system now, I don't know any of you that have grandchildren or young children, they're teaching math a different way in elementary school now. It doesn't make any sense to me, and I love math. I'm sitting there going, but if I just do this, I get the right answer. And they're like, oh, you have to break it down and do this and then do this. And it takes like 10 pages of loosely to do one question now. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. I said, an answer in math is an answer. It's either right or wrong. But if we start to look at this a little bit more intently, the word atrocious, I mean, that's a harsh word when you're looking at this. But when you think about grace, is not grace about just conquering unfairness in life? That's how we look at it, because if it's not for grace, then why does a widow's pennies count more than a rich man's millions? Why does an employer pay someone who shows up for 1 hour the same as he does everyone that has been there for the entire day? As I was getting ready to preach over the past few weeks, I came across an article, someone sent it to me. It's about the movie Amadeus, and if you've never seen the movie Amadeus, it's about Wolfgang Mozart and how, you know, his life story. And in it, one of the people that was kind of in competition with Mozart at the time was a guy named Antonio Salieri. And this guy had a desire for music. He just loved it. And he would get infuriated with Mozart because here's a guy who he thought he was just wasting his talent. And if you know the story of Mozart, you know, he liked to party, he liked to have fun. He didn't really focus on music per se, even though now, hundreds of years later, I mean, the guy was a genius. But Salieri, he got so frustrated, and he would just cry out to God, and he'd say, you know, why would you waste talent on a man like this? And one of the lines that he uses, he says, what use after all is man if not to teach God his lessons? It's an interesting statement that he makes. But if you think about it a little bit further and you go back even into the Old Testament, you start to understand that things that God does and his plan for life, they just don't make sense. For instance, why would God choose Jacob, the conniver, over someone like Esau? Why would he give supernatural powers to a delinquent like Samson? Or why would he groom just a small shepherd boy to be Israel's next king? Why would he give the gift of just the craziest wisdom in the world to a guy like Solomon, who, you know, when you know Solomon's story, I mean, he was the product of an adulterous relationship. All these Old Testament stories, there's just a scandal involved. But once you look at it from the eyes of grace, it makes complete sense. Because that's what grace does. So today we're going to look at Matthew chapter 20, the parable of the vineyard workers, a little bit more. Philip Yancey, in one of his books, he refers to this parable, and he actually terms the atrocious mathematics of the gospel. And so let's read it. So Matthew chapter 20, verses 1 to 16. I'm going to read from the NLT version. It says, "For the kingdom of heaven is like the landowner who went out early one morning to hire workers for his vineyard. He agreed to pay the normal daily wage and sent them out to work. At 9 o'clock in the morning, he was passing through the marketplace, saw some people standing around doing nothing, so he hired them, telling them he would pay them whatever was right at the end of the day. So they went to work in the vineyard. At noon again, and at 3 again, he did the same thing. And at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, he was in the town again, and saw some people standing around. He asked them, 'Why haven't you been working today?' They replied, 'Because no one has hired us.' The landowner told them, 'Then go out and join the others in my vineyard.' That evening he told the foreman to call the workers in and pay them, beginning with the last workers first. When those hired at 5 o'clock were paid, each received a full day's wage. When those hired first came to get their pay, they assumed they would receive more, but they too were paid a day's wage. When they received their pay, they protested to the owner, 'Those people worked only 1 hour, and you paid them just as much as you paid us who worked all day in the scorching heat.' He answered them, 'Friend, I haven't been unfair. Didn't you agree to work for a usual day's wage? Take your money and go. I wanted to pay the last worker the same as you. Is it against the law for me to do what I want with my money? Should you be jealous because I am kind to others? So those who are last now will be first then, and those who are first will be last.'" Just a crazy story when you think about it. But before we actually look at the parable, I did a little bit of research. I do that every now and then just for fun, to keep me on my toes. Back in those days, of course, this was in the Palestine area. And back in those days, temperatures in the daytime were normally well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, which is closing into 40 to 45 degrees Celsius here. And I mean, we think it's hot now, and it's 26. Can you imagine working all day in this blazing heat? And in the grape harvest, I found out that when the grapes are ripe, you only have a very small window to get them picked and get them in and get them processed before they actually spoil and your whole crop is gone. So you can see why the landowner wanted more and more workers in his field, because he wanted to make sure the job was done. But if we look at this parable from a mathematics standpoint, man, scandal is all through it. Because in Jesus' version, not from the NLT, but if you look at the King James Version, they use the words like, slaggard or lazy for the people that were hired at 5 in the afternoon. Because the only thing you can figure, there's no way that these people have been standing in town since 9 o'clock in the morning and it's now 5. So you would just assume, this is just me assuming, I may be wrong, but I think of these people as the guys, I have friends like this too, they get up at 1 o'clock in the afternoon because they got nothing to do. And then they just go out and hang out and see what's going on. So you can only think that there's got to be a reason why these guys haven't been hired. Because generally, if you're a good worker, you're going to be hired. So you can only just insinuate that these were not very good workers. And people knew, or people had a reputation that you don't want to hire that guy if you want the job done right. So that's the only thing you can think. But then when you get to the end of it, if you look at it from a business perspective, what owner in their right mind is going to pay someone for 1 hour what he pays people for an entire day? Because if we look at it, they actually were paid a denarius, which is actually a lot of money. That is actually the same wage that Roman soldiers were being paid in the day. So from this standpoint, it was a ridiculous amount of money for the people of the day. And what's even worse is that the people that, it's kind of funny that the landowner told his foreman, he said, "Pay those that came last first." So I don't know about you, but if I'm one of the guys that showed up at 9 o'clock in the morning and I see a guy that showed up at 5 and he gets 1 denarius, I'm probably sitting there going, man, just imagine how much we're going to get. That guy got 1, man, we're going to be rich at the end of this one. And then all of a sudden, they go up to get their pay and all of a sudden, they get the exact same. I can only imagine what they were thinking at that point. They must have just been irate at the money they were given. Sitting there going, this guy here, who did nothing all day, he showed up at the very end when we're basically cleaning up. We're not even picking grapes anymore. We're cleaning up. And he gets the same amount as we get? Are you kidding me? That just doesn't add up. And as Yancey says, he goes, the boss's action contradicted everything known about employee motivation and fair compensation. It was just a crazy economics, plain and simple. Because, anyone that's been in the business world, you know that, employee salaries, that's a big ticket item right there. And can you imagine the summer students if Amanda came in and worked from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening, 5 days a week, and Emily, taking after her dad, shows up for 1 hour a day. Cut that out, we'll edit that one out, But then can you just imagine when they show up to get their paychecks, and they get handed their envelopes and they open it up and the checks are identical? Well, if I'm Amanda, I'm like, something's wrong here. Because I'm doing all the work and you're getting paid the same. You can only think that that's what these people were thinking. So as we can tell, Jesus' story made no economic sense. But now once we start looking at it from grace, it makes complete sense. He was giving us a parable about grace, not about employee-employer relations. Grace is not about finishing last or first. Grace is simply about not even counting. We receive grace as a gift from God, not as something that we earn. And that's the point that Jesus was trying to make through the employer's response. Because this is what the employer said to his workers. He said, "Friend, I'm not being unfair to you. Did not you agree to work for this wage? Take your pay and go. I want to give the man who was hired last the same as I gave you. And don't I have the right to do that with my own money? Or are you just envious because I am so gracious?" So then we start looking and we go back to Mozart, and we're like, we look at Salieri and we say, are you just envious because he was so generous to Mozart? And Saul, was he not just envious because God was so generous to David? And the Pharisees, were you not generous because I invited the Gentiles into the kingdom of heaven so late in the game? It's crazy when you think about it from the grace standpoint. The employer in Jesus' story did not cheat anybody, and that's the key to the whole parable. He didn't cheat anybody. He gave them exactly what he said he would give them. The full-day workers got what they were promised, but their discontent rose because they thought of the math of it and they said, this doesn't make sense. And the reason I talk about this today is because there's a lot of people that I come in contact with every day that they look at it from a mathematical standpoint when they talk about their faith in Jesus and the other Christians around them. They look at it and they say, but it's not fair that God is giving them so much and I'm struggling right now. And really, there's not much you can say to people if that's the argument that they're having with you. Because all I can say, that's just God's grace. And to some people, it doesn't make sense. And I understand that. I get it. In the words of Robert Capon, he says, if the world could have been saved by good bookkeeping, it would have been saved by Moses, not Jesus. Interesting. Grace cannot be reduced to generally accepted accounting principles. So in the bottom line of ungrace, some workers deserve more than others. In the realm of grace, the word deserve does not even apply. The story turns completely when we look harder, not at the characters in the parable, but all of a sudden we look at ourselves. What I've found is that the more you read the Bible, and I think the way it's designed is we need to put ourselves in the situations that we're reading about. And so I did that one day. I was reading the parable and I said, what if I was one of those workers that was hired at 9 a.m. in the morning? How would I have felt at the end of the day? You know what? I started to think, and you know what? I probably would have been just as frustrated as those guys were. Because here you were working, busting your butt all day, out in this just sweltering heat, no break whatsoever, and just going hard. And all of a sudden these guys show up. And like I say, they're probably just doing cleanup detail at the end of the day, bringing everything in from the field. And all of a sudden they get the exact same. But then I got thinking a little bit more, and I read another article by Yancey about this parable. And he said the whole point of this parable is, he said, we're not supposed to think of ourselves as the people who showed up and were hired first thing in the morning. He said, we're supposed to think of ourselves who were hired at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And he said, when you truly think of yourself that way, he said, then this parable completely makes sense. And you get a true understanding of just how unfair grace is. And that's the whole point of it. Because when we look at the new math of grace, grace is not about human merit. It's about divine forgiveness. Grace is not about earning wages. It's about dispensing gifts. Grace is not about religious moralism or behavioral compliance to rules. It is about a complete reorientation of life to the gospel. And grace is not about finishing first or last. It's simply not about even counting. If you look back through the scriptures and you look back at the people that followed Jesus, I read an article and it says Judas and Peter were probably the two most mathematical of Jesus' disciples. And one author points out that in the gospel, when Jesus engineered the miraculous catch of fish by Peter, one of the versions of it actually says that Peter actually counted how many fish he caught. Only someone that loves numbers would waste his time counting that many fish. And then if you think about Judas, he was the guy that actually held the purse strings for the apostles. So he obviously was really good at money. But then you look at Peter later on, and he says he actually asked Jesus. He's trying to figure out some sort of formula for grace. Because he asked Jesus this question, he says, how many times shall I forgive my brother when he sins against me? Up to 7 times, Peter said. He was probably erring. He thought on the side of, a little bit more than he was thinking. Because it goes on to say the rabbis in his day had suggested 3 was the maximum number you had to forgive somebody. But what does Jesus say? He says not 7 times, but 77 times. Some manuscripts have written 70 times 7, which would be 490. Jesus in most says 7 or 77, which would be 77 times. So no matter what the number is, it's a ridiculous number, whether it's 77 times or 490 times, that you're to forgive somebody. Basically what Jesus was saying, you can never stop forgiving somebody. So it says Peter's question prompted Jesus to tell another story. And we hear about this story. It's about the servant who had somehow piled up just a massive debt to his owner. And it says the fact that realistically no servant could accumulate this type of debt, that just doesn't make sense anyway. But Jesus goes on to say that the king forgave him of his debt and set him free. And what does this guy turn around and do? He goes out and has someone else arrested who owes him money. And he says, pay back what you owe me. So when you look at it, you think, when we start looking at all of this, the only thing that makes sense when you start looking at these stories in the Bible is that if you don't look at them with the eyes of grace, none of these stories make sense, and they never will. Because common sense does not come into play when you talk about grace and when you talk about the love of Jesus. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He says, to be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in us. The more I think about Jesus' parable, the more I'm tempted to go back and say, you know what, the word atrocious is perfect for what we're talking about here. I believe Jesus gives us these stories about grace in order to call us to step completely outside of the world that we have grown up. From nursery school on, we're taught that to succeed in school, that the early bird gets the worm, or if you play sports, no pain, no gain. There is no such thing as a free lunch. Demand your rights. Get what is fairly a fair pay for what you do. We all know these rules well because we've all grown up with them. We learn from a young age to work for what you earn. It's instilled in us that we like to win. And nowadays you can't go anywhere without people insisting, well, it's my right to do this. But what we need to understand is that we get what we deserve, plain and simple. Nothing more, nothing less. There's a movie from the early 90s called The Last Emperor. It's about the youngest emperor ever in China. He was the last one. He lives this luxurious life. He has over 1,000 servants. And in one scene, his older brother asks him, what happens when you make a mistake? And the boy replies, he goes, when I do wrong, someone else is punished. And to demonstrate this, he breaks a jaw. And to pay for this mistake, one of his servants is beaten by the guards. Crazy story, and when we think about it, we look at what Jesus has given us in the gospel. Instead of us being punished for what we did, our King is punished for what we did. Complete reversal from the last emperor. And that's the glorious news of this. So once we begin to grasp just how crazy and atrocious the math is when we look at the gospel, once we experience the grace of God, we are truly driven to live for Him, because He's the one who loved us and gave Himself up for us. Yet if I care to listen, I hear a loud whisper from the gospel that I did not get what I deserved. I deserved punishment and got forgiveness. I deserved wrath and got love. I deserved prison, but I'm given a complete, clean history. I deserved stern lectures, but we're given a chance to sit on our Savior's lap. We have a banquet waiting for us. Yesterday I was mowing the lawn and I saw these people get out of a car and they walk over, and they were Jehovah's Witness, and they had a little pamphlet and they said, we're just going around asking people, and the question at the top was, do you believe the suffering in the world will end? He goes, how would you answer that question? I looked him straight in the eye and said, yes, I believe it will end. He was kind of taken aback. He goes, you do? I said, yeah. Because I said, someday, I said, those who believe are going to sit with Jesus in heaven where there is no more suffering. And he looked at me and I said, I'm a youth pastor. He said, okay, thank you for your time. And he turned around. But I truly believe that. I live by the gospel. I live by grace. Because if grace did not exist, I can tell you folks, I would not be standing on this stage today. No chance I would be here. Grace is given to us, and that's why I can soundly answer the question, will the suffering in this world end? And I can say, yes, it will. Someday we will be with our Savior in heaven, and there will be no suffering. So folks, when you read the gospel, when you read the stories in the Bible, you can't try to think of them from a logical perspective. You can't try to think of them from a mathematical perspective, because they don't make any sense. But if you put on the eyes of grace, everything that is said in the Bible rings true. And Jesus says it's because of what He has done for us, not what we will ever do for Him, that we have a chance to live with Him forever. I'm going to close in prayer, and as I do, I'm going to ask the worship team to come back up. Gracious God and Heavenly Father, man, I thank You for grace. If it wasn't for grace, Lord,